Have you ever been abandoned by your own flesh and blood at the most important moment of your life? This story begins with a brutal text message on graduation day and ends with a phone call that shook Wall Street to its core. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't planned. It's built one determined step at a time, until the day your success becomes their downfall. My name is Rachel Monroe, and at 26, I thought I had finally made it. The Hudson State University graduation ceremony was everything I'd dreamed of. The sea of black caps, the proud families clutching flowers, the promise of new beginnings hanging thick in the May air. I adjusted my cap one more time, feeling the weight of my business degree and the 4 years of sacrifice it represented. The ceremony had ended 20 minutes ago, and I stood on the quad watching my classmates pose for pictures with their parents, grandparents, siblings, entire support systems that had shown up to celebrate this milestone. Sarah from my marketing class was laughing as her dad lifted her in a bear hug. Marcus, who'd been my study partner through those brutal finance courses, was already planning dinner reservations with his whole extended family. And then there was me, clutching my phone with white knuckles. The text had come through at exactly 11:47 a.m., right as Dean Williams was calling my name to cross the stage. I'd felt the buzz in my pocket but ignored it, savoring my moment in the spotlight. Walking across that stage, shaking hands with the dean, hearing the scattered applause. It should have been perfect. It wasn't until I was back in my seat that I checked the message. The sender, Dad, Robert Monroe, the man who'd built a small empire in Chicago real estate, who drove a Mercedes that cost more than most people's houses, who always reminded me that money was the only measure of success that mattered. Don't expect help anymore. You're on your own now. That was it. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of the magna cum laude cord around my neck or the fact that I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for this degree. Just a cold dismissal, delivered with the same emotional detachment he'd perfected since the divorce 8 years ago. I read it again, hoping I'd misunderstood, but the words were crystal clear, each one a small knife twist. Around me, the celebration continued, families making plans for lunch, taking selfies, promising to frame diplomas. The contrast was suffocating. My phone buzzed again. For a split second, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he was clarifying. Maybe there was more to the message. Instead, it was my mom. So proud of you. Honey, wish I could be there, but you know I couldn't get the time off. Love you. Mom, Marianne Monroe, well, Marianne Stevens now. Though she'd kept Dad's name for my sake during high school. She was probably grading papers in her cramped Cleveland apartment, the same one we'd moved to after the divorce when Dad decided child support was more of a suggestion than an obligation. She would have given anything to be here, but a substitute teacher's salary doesn't exactly allow for last-minute flights to upstate New York. I looked around at the families again, and something cold settled in my stomach. This wasn't just about graduation day. This was Dad's final statement, his way of making sure I understood exactly where I stood in his world. He'd supported me financially through college, barely, and always with strings attached. But now that I had my degree, I was officially cut off. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 4 years, he'd criticized my choice to study business instead of following him into real estate. You're wasting your time with those sustainability courses, he'd said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. Nobody makes real money saving trees. But now that I had the diploma he'd pushed for, he was done with me. I walked to the parking lot alone, my heels clicking against the asphalt. My beat-up Honda Civic looked embarrassingly shabby next to the BMWs and Audis that had brought other families to campus. But it was mine, bought with money I'd earned slinging coffee at 6 a.m. before my 8 a.m. classes, working double shifts at the campus bookstore, tutoring struggling freshmen in economics. As I drove away from Hudson State for the last time, watching the clock tower fade in my rearview mirror, I made myself a promise. Dad thought he was cutting me loose, abandoning me to fail without his money and connections. He probably expected me to come crawling back within a year. begging for a job at one of his companies or a loan to cover my student debt. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The girl who'd worked her way through college, who'd survived on ramen noodles and sheer determination, who'd built a 3.8 GPA while juggling 3 jobs, that girl wasn't going anywhere. She was just getting started. The cracks in our family hadn't appeared overnight. They'd been building since I was 12, growing wider with each broken promise and missed birthday until the divorce made them impossible to ignore. I grew up in Shaker Heights, a middle-class suburb of Cleveland where the houses had character and the neighbors knew each other's names. Our colonial-style home sat on Maple Street, with its blue shutters and the oak tree I used to climb when Mom called me in for dinner. Back then, Dad was just starting his real estate business, working 16-hour days and coming home exhausted but proud of what he was building. Mom was the constant in those early years. Mary Ann Monroe taught 8th grade English at the local middle school, and she brought that same patience and dedication home with her every night. I remember her grading papers at the kitchen table while helping me with homework, red pen in one hand and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago in the other. "Education is the one thing no one can take away from you," she'd say whenever I complained about studying. She lived by those words, even when life proved that people could take away just about everything else. The change in Dad started when his business took off. What began as flipping houses in Cleveland's rougher neighborhoods evolved into commercial developments, then luxury condos, then an empire that stretched across 3 states. Success suited him, but it also consumed him. Family dinners became business calls. Weekend trips to the lake became client meetings. By the time I turned 14, I barely saw him except when he was lecturing me about grades or money. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday in March, 2 weeks after my 15th birthday. I found Mom crying at that same kitchen table where she'd helped me with so many homework assignments. Dad had already moved out, to a penthouse downtown. I later learned, though he waited 3 months to tell me about it. "Your father thinks he's outgrown us," Mom said, trying to explain the unexplainable to a teenager who still believed families were supposed to stick together. What she didn't say, but what I figured out later, was that Dad had been having an affair with his business partner's daughter. Apparently, a high school English teacher wasn't sophisticated enough for a man of his new status. The custody arrangement was a joke. Every other weekend, which quickly became once a month, which became major holidays only. Dad would pick me up in whatever flashy car he was driving that year, the Mercedes, then the Porsche, then the Bentley, and take me to expensive restaurants where he'd spend the entire meal on his phone. You need to understand the value of money," he'd say during these awkward dinners, cutting into his $50 steak while I picked at overpriced pasta I didn't even want. "Everything in life comes down to profit and loss. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be." Meanwhile, Mom and I moved to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that had seen better days. The walls were thin, the heating barely worked, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly safe after dark. But Mom never complained. She took on tutoring gigs in the evenings, worked summer school programs, and somehow still managed to make our little apartment feel like home. That's when I learned what real work looked like. At 16, I got my first job at a local coffee shop, dragging myself out of bed at 5:30 a.m. to open for the morning rush. The money wasn't much, but it was mine, earned by memorizing orders, cleaning espresso machines, and smiling at customers who treated me like furniture. After school, I'd rush to my second job at a fast food place near the mall. The work was mindless and the uniform smelled like fryer oil, but it paid $8 an hour and let me pick up extra shifts on weekends. I'd come home at 10 p.m., with grease under my fingernails and homework still to do, while Dad was probably networking at some charity gala where a single plate cost more than I made in a week. The contrast became impossible to ignore. During my rare visits to Dad's penthouse, I'd walk across marble floors and stare out at a view of Lake Erie that probably cost him 7 figures. He'd show off his wine collection, his art, his custom suits that hung in a closet bigger than my bedroom. Everything was pristine, expensive, and cold. "This is what success looks like," he'd say, gesturing at his designer furniture and imported fixtures. This is what happens when you make smart choices with money. But I saw something else in that penthouse. I saw a man who'd traded his family for square footage, who measured his worth in stock portfolios and property values. His refrigerator was empty except for expensive champagne and takeout containers. His walls were covered with awards and certificates, but not a single family photo. When I turned 18 and started looking at colleges, Dad made his position clear. He'd pay for tuition, barely, but only if I studied something practical. Business was acceptable. Real estate was preferred. Anything involving environmental science or sustainability was hippie nonsense that doesn't pay the bills. "You want to save the world," he said during one particularly heated argument my senior year. "Start by saving yourself some money. The planet will be fine. Your bank account might not be." So I chose business, but I loaded up on environmental economics electives and sustainability courses whenever I could. I told myself I was playing the long game, learning his language so I could eventually speak my own. But even with his financial support, I still worked 3 jobs through college: coffee shop at dawn, campus bookstore between classes, tutoring struggling freshmen until midnight. Mom would call every Sunday, always at 7 p.m., always asking about my classes and my friends and whether I was eating enough. She never asked about Dad, though I knew she worried about the growing distance between us. Sometimes I'd hear the exhaustion in her voice. Another parent conference, another stack of essays to grade, another month of stretching a teacher's salary to cover rent and groceries and the little luxuries that made life bearable. She deserved better. We both did. And someday, I promised myself, I'd make sure she got it. The idea first came to me during my junior year at Hudson State, in Professor Martinez's environmental economics class. We were discussing the disconnect between traditional investment models and sustainable business practices when something clicked. I scribbled furiously in my notebook, sketching out connections between investors, green startups, and transparency metrics that could change everything. That night, I stayed up until 3 p.m. in my dorm room, building out the concept. What if there was a platform that didn't just connect investors with sustainable businesses, but actually verified their environmental impact? What if we could create a marketplace where capital flowed toward companies that were genuinely making a difference, not just greenwashing their way to profits? I called it EcoVest, a fintech platform that would revolutionize how people invested in sustainability. The more I researched, the more excited I became. Traditional venture capital was pouring billions into green companies without any real oversight. Investors were getting burned by startups that talked a good game about saving the planet but had no measurable impact. Meanwhile, genuinely innovative companies were struggling to get funding because they couldn't compete with the marketing budgets of their less scrupulous competitors. My vision was simple: create a platform that used data analytics to verify environmental claims, connecting serious investors with businesses that could prove their sustainability credentials. It would be transparent, accountable, and profitable, everything the current system wasn't. The problem was, I had no money, no connections, and no credibility in the investment world. But I had something else: 4 years of watching my father succeed in business. Even if I disagreed with his methods, I'd absorbed his lessons about market analysis, risk assessment, and customer acquisition. I just planned to use them for something he'd never understand. Christmas break of my junior year, I decided to test the waters. Dad had invited me to Chicago for the holidays, one of his obligatory gestures that usually involved expensive dinners and lectures about my future. This time, I came prepared. We were sitting in his penthouse, the city sparkling below us through floor-to-ceiling windows. When I pulled out my laptop, he was nursing a glass of scotch that probably cost more than my textbooks, already looking bored with our conversation. "I want to show you something," I said, opening my presentation. I'd spent weeks perfecting it, anticipating every objection he might raise. For the next 20 minutes, I walked him through EcoVest. I showed him market research, projected returns, competitive analysis. I explained how the platform would generate revenue through transaction fees and premium analytics services. I even included financial models that projected profitability within 18 months. Dad listened with the same expression he wore during his business meetings, polite interest masking complete skepticism. When I finished, he set down his glass and leaned back in his leather chair. "Rachel," he said, his tone patronizing in that way that made my skin crawl. "This is very creative, but let me explain something about the real world." He stood up and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back like some kind of corporate philosopher. "Money doesn't care about your feelings. Investors don't care about polar bears or carbon footprints or whatever cause you learned about in school. They care about returns. Period." "But that's exactly my point," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Sustainable businesses are showing better long-term returns. The data proves whatever you want it to prove," he interrupted. "You're talking about a niche market, a trend that'll be forgotten in 5 years. Real money, generational wealth, comes from fundamentals: energy, real estate, manufacturing, the things people actually need." He turned back to face me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never noticed before. Not just dismissal, but genuine pity, like I was a child who still believed in Santa Claus. "You want my advice? Drop this environmental fantasy and focus on something practical. I could get you an internship at Morrison & Associates. They handle commercial real estate investments. Learn the business from the ground up, the way I did." "I don't want to learn your business," I said, closing my laptop harder than necessary. "I want to build my own." Dad laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money? What connections you think you're going to walk into Silicon Valley with a PowerPoint and come out with funding? That's not how this works." "Then I'll figure out another way." "Rachel." His voice softened, which somehow made it worse. "I'm trying to help you avoid a very expensive mistake. This startup thing, it's a hobby for rich kids whose parents can afford to let them fail. You don't have that luxury." The worst part was that he wasn't trying to be cruel. In his mind, he was being practical, realistic, protective even. He genuinely believed that my dreams were naive and that crushing them now would save me pain later. But sitting in that gleaming penthouse, surrounded by the symbols of his success, I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just about EcoVest anymore. It was about proving that there was more than one way to build an empire. It was about showing him that success didn't have to come at the expense of everything you claimed to care about. "I understand," I said, packing up my laptop. "Thanks for listening." He seemed relieved that I was taking his rejection so well. We finished our visit with small talk about school and work, both of us pretending that conversation hadn't happened. But on the plane back to campus, I pulled out my notebook and started writing. Not a business plan this time. A manifesto. A promise to myself that I would prove him wrong. That I would build something meaningful and profitable and lasting. Something that would make the world better while making me rich enough to never need his approval again. The skepticism in his voice, the pity in his eyes, the casual dismissal of everything I cared about, it all became fuel. Every time I doubted myself over the next year, I remembered that conversation. Every time the work seemed impossible, I thought about his laugh. He thought I was naive. He thought I didn't understand how the real world worked. He had no idea he'd just created his biggest competitor. The rejection letters started arriving 3 weeks after graduation. I'd sent my resume to 47 companies, from Goldman Sachs to tiny startups I'd found on Angel List. The responses were brutally consistent. "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Without Dad's connections or a trust fund to fall back on, I was just another business graduate competing with thousands of others who had better GPAs, better internships, or better last names. My savings account had exactly $2,300, enough for maybe 2 months of rent and ramen noodles. That's how I ended up at TechSpire Solutions, a mid-tier software company in a glass office building that tried too hard to look innovative. The job posting had been vague: marketing associate, dynamic environment, growth opportunities. The reality was data entry, email campaigns for enterprise software, and pretending to be excited about cloud computing solutions that put people to sleep. My manager, Janet Brewster, was a woman in her 50s who'd been doing the same job for 15 years and seemed determined to make sure I understood my place. She assigned me to update spreadsheets, schedule social media posts about server migrations, and write blog content about synergistic workflow optimization. Corporate speak that meant absolutely nothing. "Remember, Rachel," she said during my second week, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed my latest blog draft. "We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. Just follow the templates and keep the messaging consistent with our brand voice." The brand voice, it turned out, was aggressively boring. Every piece of content had to go through 3 rounds of approval, and by the time it was published, any trace of personality or genuine insight had been systematically removed. I was writing marketing copy for software that helped other people write marketing copy. The irony was suffocating. But I needed the job. $42,000 a year was barely enough to cover my student loan payments and the studio apartment I'd rented in a converted warehouse district. But it was survival money. I showed up at 8 a.m., performed my assigned tasks with professional competence, and left at 5 p.m. sharp. The real work began at 5:30. Every evening, I'd walk the 6 blocks from Techspire to my apartment, stopping at the corner deli for dinner, usually a sandwich that cost $3.50, sometimes stretching to soup if I'd had a particularly good day. By 6 p.m., I was at my kitchen table, laptop open, working on EcoVest. The apartment was barely 400 square feet, with thin walls that let me hear my neighbor's television and a radiator that clanged like a ghost in chains. But it was mine, and the kitchen table became my command center. I'd spread out notebooks, legal pads, and printouts of market research, turning my tiny space into a startup war room. The first months were the hardest. I was building everything from scratch: wireframes for the platform, financial projections, competitive analysis, user persona research. I taught myself basic coding through YouTube tutorials and online courses, staying up until 2 a.m. to understand databases and API integrations. The rejection emails from investors started arriving in September. I'd spent weeks crafting the perfect pitch deck, researching every venture capital firm that had ever invested in fintech or sustainability. I sent 43 personalized emails, each one carefully tailored to the firm's portfolio and investment thesis. "Thank you for reaching out, but this doesn't align with our current investment strategy. We're not taking meetings for pre-seed stage companies at this time. Interesting concept, but we'd need to see significant traction before considering investment." The form rejections were almost worse than silence. At least silence let me imagine they were still considering it. The actual responses made it clear that I didn't even register as a possibility. By October, I was questioning everything. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe I was naive to think I could build something meaningful in a world that only cared about proven formulas and safe bets. Maybe I should have taken that internship at Morrison & Associates. But then I met Michael Reyes. It was a Thursday evening at a startup networking event I'd found on Meetup. The venue was a co-working space in the Arts District, the kind of place that served craft beer and had motivational quotes painted on exposed brick walls. I almost didn't go. The $20 entry fee was a significant expense in my budget, but I was desperate for any kind of connection to the entrepreneurial world. Michael was presenting that night, talking about his role as a program manager at Tech Forward, a startup incubator that specialized in early-stage companies. He was probably 40, with graying temples and the kind of calm confidence that comes from having seen hundreds of pitches. During the Q&A, I asked about their application process. "We're always looking for founders who understand their market deeply," he said, making eye contact with me across the room. "Technical skills can be learned, but passion and domain expertise, that's what separates successful startups from failed ones." After his presentation, I worked up the courage to approach him. I had 30 seconds to make an impression before he moved on to the next person. So I led with the problem. "Sustainable investing is a $40 trillion market, but there's no reliable way to verify environmental claims," I said. "Companies are lying about their impact, investors are getting burned, and genuinely innovative businesses can't get funding because they can't compete with greenwashing marketing budgets." Michael stopped shuffling through his business cards and looked at me directly. Go on. I explained EcoVest in 3 minutes, the transparency tools, the verification process, the revenue model. He asked 2 questions: whether I'd identified specific pain points for both sides of the market, and whether I had any technical background. I'm teaching myself to code, I admitted, but I've spent 4 years studying the intersection of finance and environmental policy. I understand both sides of this problem. He handed me his card. Send me your deck. We're starting our winter cohort applications in December. Walking home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from needing any opportunity, but the real kind that comes from being understood. Michael hadn't looked at me like I was naive or overly ambitious. He'd looked at me like I was a founder. The work intensified after that. I had 6 weeks to perfect my application, which meant 6 weeks of 18-hour days, marketing spreadsheets during business hours, EcoVest development from 6 p.m. until midnight, application materials from midnight until 3 a.m. I was exhausted, caffeinated, and running on fumes, but for the first time since graduation, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of just surviving another day. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: my upstairs neighbor, Aaron Blake. Aaron Blake knocked on my door at 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, holding a cup of coffee and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd been debating this conversation for weeks. I'm sorry to bother you, he said, running his hand through disheveled hair, but I think we might be able to help each other. I'd seen Aaron around the building, mid-20s, always carrying a laptop bag, the kind of guy who looked like he lived on energy drinks and deadlines. We'd exchanged polite nods in the hallway, but this was the first time he'd actually spoken to me. I'm a software developer, he continued, glancing past me at my apartment, and I couldn't help but notice you're working on something that requires a lot of late-night coding. The Wi-Fi networks don't lie. EcoVest development shows up every night around 6 p.m. I felt my face flush. I'd been so focused on building the platform that I hadn't considered how visible my work habits were to anyone paying attention to network traffic. You're not in trouble, he said quickly, seeing my expression. I'm actually impressed. I looked up the domain registration, saw some of your early wireframes when you accidentally left your network unsecured last week. What you're building, it's exactly the kind of thing the tech world needs more of. That conversation changed everything. Aaron turned out to be a full-stack developer who'd been freelancing for 3 years, building everything from e-commerce sites to mobile apps. More importantly, he was as frustrated with the current state of tech as I was with traditional finance. Every project I work on is about optimizing ad revenue or finding new ways to monetize user data, he said as we sat at my kitchen table, reviewing my prototype. I got into programming because I thought technology could solve real problems. Instead, I'm helping rich people get richer. Within a week, we'd struck a deal. Aaron would help me build EcoVest's technical infrastructure in exchange for equity and the promise of a full-time role if we got funding. He brought expertise I desperately needed: database architecture, security protocols, user interface design. I brought market knowledge, business strategy, and the kind of obsessive determination that turns ideas into companies. Our workspace was my kitchen table and his living room, connected by a shared Wi-Fi network we'd nicknamed Startup Life. We established a routine: I'd finish my day job at TechSpire, grab dinner, and be at Aaron's place by 6:30 p.m. We'd work until midnight, sometimes later when we were on a roll. The first beta version of EcoVest launched in January, hosted on a server that cost us $60 a month, a significant expense that we split equally. The platform was basic, but functional sustainable startups could create profiles, upload impact data, and connect with verified investors. The verification system was manual at first. Aaron and I would spend hours researching each company, checking their claims against public databases and regulatory filings. Our first real test came sooner than expected. Michael Reyes had accepted my application to Tech Forward's winter cohort, which meant I had to pitch EcoVest to a room full of investors, entrepreneurs, and industry experts. The presentation was scheduled for February 15th at 7 p.m., exactly 90 days after Aaron knocked on my door. "This is it," I told him the night before, pacing around his apartment while he made last-minute adjustments to our demo. "Everything we've built leads to this moment." "The platform is solid," he said, fingers flying across his keyboard. "The user interface is clean, the data verification works, and the matching algorithm actually connects the right investors with the right companies. Now you just have to sell it." The venue was a conference room at Tech Forward's downtown office. All glass and chrome and strategic lighting designed to make everything look more important. 25 people sat around a horseshoe-shaped table, their faces illuminated by laptop screens and the kind of confident expressions that come from having seen hundreds of pitches. I'd practiced my presentation dozens of times, but standing at the front of that room, looking at investors who collectively controlled millions of dollars, my carefully rehearsed opening lines suddenly felt inadequate. Then I saw my father. He was sitting in the back row, arms crossed, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I hadn't invited him. I hadn't even told him about the presentation. But there he was, watching me with the same skeptical expression he'd worn during our Christmas conversation. The sight of him should have been devastating. Instead, it was energizing. Every doubt I'd had about my pitch, every moment of imposter syndrome, crystallized into pure determination. He'd come here expecting me to fail. He was about to be disappointed. "Sustainable investing is a $40 trillion market built on a foundation of lies," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Investors are pouring money into companies that claim to save the planet but can't prove their impact. Meanwhile, genuinely innovative businesses are starving for capital because they can't compete with greenwashing marketing budgets." For the next 15 minutes, I walked them through EcoVest's solution. I showed them our verification system, demonstrated the platform's matching algorithm, and presented financial projections that proved the business model was both profitable and scalable. Aaron had prepared a live demo that let the audience see exactly how the platform worked. Investors creating profiles, startups uploading impact data, the system generating compatibility scores based on actual environmental metrics. The questions came fast and sharp. How would we scale the verification process? What prevented competitors from copying our model? How did we plan to acquire users on both sides of the marketplace? I answered each one, drawing on months of research and the kind of deep market knowledge that only comes from obsessive focus. When someone asked about customer acquisition costs, I had spreadsheets. When they questioned our revenue projections, I had case studies from similar platforms in adjacent markets. But the real moment came when an investor named Patricia Hoffman, managing partner at Silver Oak Ventures, asked about my background. "You're 26 years old with no previous startup experience," she said, her tone neutral but pointed. "What makes you think you can execute on this vision?" I looked directly at my father before answering. "Because I've spent the last 8 months building this company while working a full-time job, teaching myself to code, and proving that the market demand is real. We have 23 verified companies on the platform and 12 accredited investors actively using our matching system. This isn't a theoretical business anymore. It's a growing company that needs capital to scale." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia smiled. Not the polite smile that means, "nice try," but the genuine smile that means, "I'm interested." "We'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting," she said. "Can you come in next week?" Walking out of that conference room, I felt like I was floating. Aaron was grinning like we'd just won the lottery, and Michael Reyes clapped me on the shoulder with the kind of pride that suggested I'd exceeded his expectations. My father was waiting by the elevators. "Impressive presentation," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Though I noticed you didn't mention anything about actual revenue." "We're pre-revenue," I replied, "but we have proven demand and a clear path to profitability." He straightened his tie, a gesture I recognized as his tell when he was thinking. "Well, I suppose we'll see if your optimism translates to actual results." The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside without another word. As they closed, I caught his reflection in the polished steel, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been respect. Or maybe it was concern. Silver Oak Ventures wrote us a check for $2.5 million on March 23rd. I stared at the number so many times I started to doubt it was real. More money than I'd ever seen. Enough to quit TechSpire, hire a real team, and move EcoVest out of Aaron's living room. Our new office was a converted warehouse in the tech district, with exposed brick walls and enough space for 12 employees. We hired carefully Maria Santos, a data scientist from MIT who'd been working on environmental impact algorithms, James Wright, a marketing director who'd launched 3 successful fintech startups, and 4 junior developers who shared Aaron's passion for building something meaningful. Within 6 months, EcoVest had transformed from a scrappy platform into a legitimate player in the sustainable investing space. We'd verified over 200 companies, connected them with accredited investors, and facilitated more than $30 million in funding. Our success story became the kind of case study that business magazines loved. Young founder disrupts traditional industry, proves that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. The breakthrough came in August when we helped Thread Forward, a textile recycling startup from Portland, raise $8 million from a consortium of impact investors. Their story was perfect. 2 recent college graduates who'd developed a process for turning discarded clothing into high-quality yarn, creating jobs in underserved communities while diverting waste from landfills. The funding round made national news. Forbes ran a feature titled "The Platform Making Green Dreams Come True," with Thread Forward's founders on the cover and a sidebar about EcoVest's role in connecting them with the right investors. TechCrunch called us the matchmaker sustainable startups have been waiting for. Even the Wall Street Journal, not exactly known for environmental enthusiasm, praised our data-driven approach to impact investing. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I was reading about Green Axis for the first time. The article appeared in VentureBeat on a Tuesday morning in September. New platform promises faster, cheaper access to green investment. The description made my blood run cold. Green Axis offered essentially the same service as EcoVest, connecting sustainable startups with investors, but with lower fees and what they called streamlined verification processes. Their website looked like a carbon copy of ours, down to the color scheme and layout. They'd even adopted similar language in their marketing materials, promising transparent, accountable investing for a sustainable future. The only significant difference was their approach to verification. Where EcoVest required extensive documentation and third-party validation of environmental claims, Green Axis accepted company self-reporting and basic regulatory compliance. "They're basically Uber to our taxi service," Aaron said when I showed him the article. "Same destination, but they're promising to get there faster and cheaper by cutting corners." The real blow came when I saw their funding announcement 2 weeks later. Green Axis had raised $15 million in Series A funding, led by Monroe Capital Partners. Monroe, my father's investment firm. I called him that afternoon, my hands shaking as I dialed his direct line. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that familiar tone of polite professionalism. "Rachel, I was wondering when you'd call." "You funded our competitor," I said, skipping any pretense of small talk. "You literally invested in a company designed to put us out of business." "I invested in a company with a superior business model," he replied. "Lower overhead, faster time to market, more attractive unit economics. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. My voice was rising, and I didn't care who in the office could hear me. "You're my father. You sat in that room and watched me pitch EcoVest, then turned around and funded someone else to do the exact same thing." "Not the exact same thing," he said calmly. "Green Axis understands that investors care about returns first and environmental impact second. They've streamlined their verification process to focus on what actually matters: financial performance. Their verification process is a joke. They're letting companies make whatever environmental claims they want without any real oversight. And yet, they're growing faster than you are." I could hear papers shuffling in the background, as if this conversation was just another item on his daily agenda. "Rachel, I tried to warn you about this market. Sustainable investing is a trend, not a fundamental shift. Smart money gets in early and gets out before the bubble bursts. This isn't a bubble. Climate change is real, and investors are finally starting to understand that environmental risks are financial risks. Maybe, but in the meantime, Green Axis is capturing market share while you're bogged down in idealistic verification processes that slow down deal flow. I'm not in the business of funding lost causes. The line went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost paternal. You're talented, Rachel. You've built something impressive, but you're letting perfect be the enemy of profitable. There's still time to pivot, to learn from what Green Axis is doing right. While what they're doing right is lying to investors and enabling greenwashing, that's not a pivot I'm interested in making. Then I'm afraid you're going to learn some very expensive lessons about market competition. He hung up without saying goodbye. That evening, I sat in our office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at Green Axis's website and trying to process what had just happened. My father hadn't just invested in a competitor. He'd weaponized his knowledge of our business model to fund a company designed to undercut us. Every strength he'd identified in our pitch had become a weakness for Green Axis to exploit. They were cheaper because they didn't invest in real verification. They were faster because they didn't do thorough due diligence. They were more business-friendly because they prioritized investor convenience over environmental accountability. And according to the latest industry reports, it was working. Green Axis had signed up 60 companies in their first month, nearly a third of our total user base. Their marketing emphasized speed and efficiency, painting EcoVest as slow and bureaucratic by comparison. "Well, we need to respond to this," James said during our emergency strategy meeting the next morning. "Our user acquisition has slowed since they launched. Some of our existing companies are asking why their competitors are getting funded faster through Green Axis." "Because their competitors are lying about their environmental impact," I said. "Should we start lying too?" "We should consider whether our verification standards are creating unnecessary friction," Maria suggested diplomatically. "Maybe there's a middle ground between their approach and ours." I looked around the conference table at the team we'd built, all of them smart and committed and genuinely invested in EcoVest's success. They were right to be concerned. In the startup world, momentum was everything, and we were losing ours to a company that had copied our model while abandoning our principles. But looking at Green Axis's website, reading their marketing materials that promised everything we did but faster and cheaper, I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just business competition anymore. This was a battle for the future of sustainable investing. And more personally, it was my father's final attempt to prove that his worldview was the only one that mattered. He thought he could beat me by funding a cheaper, faster version of my company. He thought investors would choose convenience over accountability, speed over substance. He was about to learn that some battles are worth fighting even when the odds are against you. The pressure to change our model intensified through October. Patricia Hoffman called me directly after our monthly board meeting, her voice carrying the kind of diplomatic concern that venture capitalists perfect when their investments start underperforming. "Rachel, we need to talk about market positioning," she said. "Green Axis is capturing significant market share, and some of our LPs are asking hard questions about EcoVest's growth trajectory." I was walking through downtown, phone pressed to my ear, watching office workers hurry past with their evening coffee. The city felt different now that I knew my father was actively working against me. Every glass tower could house an investor he'd influenced. Every business meeting could be a deal I'd lose to his protege. "Our standards are what differentiate us," I said. "If we lower them to compete with Green Axis, we become just another platform enabling greenwashing." "I understand your position, but differentiation only matters if you survive long enough to prove its value. We're seeing companies migrate to their platform because the funding process is faster. Speed matters in this market." That night, I called an all-hands meeting. The entire team gathered in our conference room. Aaron, Maria, James, and the 8 other people who'd joined our mission to revolutionize sustainable investing. I could see the stress in their faces. They'd all read the industry reports. watched our growth metrics plateau while Green Axis celebrated new user milestones every week. I know what everyone's thinking, I began. The board wants us to streamline our verification process. The media is calling us slow and bureaucratic. Our competitors are gaining ground by making everything faster and cheaper. James shifted in his seat. Rachel, maybe we should consider… No. My voice was sharper than I intended. I've spent the last month hearing about compromises and middle grounds and finding ways to be more competitive. But here's what nobody's talking about. We're not just building a business. We're building the infrastructure for a new kind of economy. I pulled up our latest impact report on the conference room screen. Our platform has facilitated $68 million in funding for companies with verified environmental impact. Not claimed impact, verified impact. These aren't startups that bought carbon offsets to greenwash their marketing. These are companies actually solving climate problems. Maria raised her hand tentatively. But Green Axis is claiming similar impact numbers with their portfolio. Because they're lying! I clicked to the next slide, which Aaron and I had spent 3 days preparing. Remember Thread Forward, the textile recycling company that got all that media attention? They just applied to Green Axis claiming they can process 50,000 pounds of waste per month. We have documentation proving their maximum capacity is 8,000 pounds. The room went quiet. I continued clicking through slides, each one showing discrepancies between Green Axis companies' claimed impact and their actual capabilities. Solar startups exaggerating their energy production, water purification companies inflating their treatment capacity, agricultural tech firms misrepresenting their carbon sequestration rates. So what do? Aaron asked. Expose them. We do something better, I said. We build something they can't copy. Over the next 6 weeks, we worked 18-hour days to develop what we called the EcoVest Transparency Engine. Using blockchain technology and real-time data feeds, we created a system that could continuously monitor and verify environmental claims. Instead of relying on quarterly reports and annual audits, our platform would track energy usage, waste production, and resource consumption in real time. The technical challenges were enormous. Maria led a team of data scientists in developing algorithms that could process satellite imagery, utility records, and supply chain data to create comprehensive impact profiles. Aaron architected a system that could integrate with everything from smart meters to shipping databases. James worked with environmental organizations to establish credibility standards that would satisfy both investors and activists. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: investigative journalism. On November 22nd, the Environmental Defense Fund published a report titled The Greenwashing Economy: How Investment Platforms Enable Environmental Fraud. The report examined both EcoVest and Green Axis, comparing the actual environmental performance of companies funded through each platform. The results were devastating for our competitors. While 93% of EcoVest-funded companies met or exceeded their environmental claims, only 37% of Green Axis companies achieved their stated impact goals. The report documented systematic exaggerations, fabricated data, and outright fraud among companies that had passed Green Axis's streamlined verification. The story exploded across financial media. Bloomberg ran a front-page feature questioning whether speed and convenience in sustainable investing were undermining the entire movement. The Wall Street Journal published an editorial calling for stronger oversight of impact investment platforms. Even TechCrunch, which had previously praised Green Axis's rapid growth, ran a critical analysis of their verification practices. But the most satisfying coverage came from Forbes, which published an investigative piece titled The Real Cost of Fake Green. The article profiled 3 Green Axis companies that had systematically misrepresented their environmental impact, burning through millions in investor capital while producing negligible actual benefits. So, this isn't just about misleading investors, the Forbes reporter wrote. It's about diverting desperately needed capital away from companies that are actually solving environmental problems. When fake green companies get funding, real green companies don't. The market response was swift and brutal. Within a week of the Forbes article, 12 companies had migrated from Green Axis to EcoVest. including two that had raised significant funding through our competitor. Investor interest in our transparency engine intensified, with pension funds and institutional investors requesting demos of our real-time verification capabilities. More importantly, the media narrative shifted. Instead of being portrayed as slow and bureaucratic, EcoVest was now being called the gold standard for sustainable investment verification. Business Insider ran a feature titled, "Why Smart Money is Choosing Slow Money," profiling investors who preferred our thorough due diligence over Green Axis's speed. The vindication felt even sweeter when I saw the December edition of Venture Capital Review, which featured a cover story about the importance of due diligence in impact investing. The article quoted several prominent investors, including Patricia Hoffman. We're seeing a clear market preference for platforms that prioritize verification over velocity," she said. "EcoVest's approach takes longer, but it delivers actual results. In sustainable investing, accuracy matters more than speed." Reading that quote, sitting in our conference room on a Thursday evening in December, I felt something I hadn't experienced since graduation day: complete confidence in the path I'd chosen. Green Axis was still operating, still funding companies, still claiming to revolutionize sustainable investing, but their reputation was permanently damaged, and smart money was flowing toward platforms that could prove their impact. My father had tried to beat me by funding a cheaper, faster version of my vision. Instead, he'd inadvertently proved that there was no substitute for doing things right. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I was winning. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday in February, exactly 18 months after my father had written me off as a naive idealist destined for expensive failure. "Rachel," Jordan Klein's voice was electric with excitement. "Are you sitting down?" Jordan was our CFO now, a Harvard MBA who'd joined EcoVest 6 months earlier when it became clear we needed someone who could speak fluent Wall Street. I was in our new corner office. We'd moved again, this time to a full floor in a downtown high-rise, reviewing our Q4 impact report. "What's going on?" I asked, though something in his tone made my pulse quicken. "Goldman wants to lead our IPO. Morgan Stanley is interested in co-managing. We're looking at a valuation north of $2 billion. The words hit me like a physical force. $2 billion. With a B. I set down my coffee cup carefully, afraid my hands might be shaking. "The transparency engine pushed us over the edge," Jordan continued. "Institutional investors are calling it the gold standard for ESG verification. Pension funds want in. Sovereign wealth funds are asking for meetings. The European Union is considering making our verification standards mandatory for sustainable investment reporting." I walked to my window, looking down at the city where I'd once served coffee at 5:30 a.m. for $8 an hour. Somewhere out there, Green Axis was imploding in spectacular fashion. The SEC had launched an investigation into their verification practices after the Environmental Defense Fund report. 3 of their portfolio companies had been exposed as outright frauds. Monroe Capital Partners was facing a class action lawsuit from investors who'd lost money on their streamlined due diligence. "There's something else," Jordan said. "Robert Monroe called this morning. He wants a meeting." My father had tried to reach me 6 times over the past month as news of our pending IPO leaked to industry insiders. I'd ignored every call, every email, every attempt at reconciliation disguised as business interest. But apparently, he'd found another way to get my attention. "He didn't call you directly," Jordan continued. "He called our board. Specifically, he called Patricia Hoffman. He's proposing a merger. Monroe Capital Partners would acquire EcoVest for cash and stock. He's offering $3 billion. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He wants to buy the company he tried to destroy." "It gets better. He wants to retain you as CEO and maintain our verification standards. According to Patricia, he said something about recognizing the long-term value of authentic, sustainable investing." The audacity was breathtaking. After 18 months of trying to prove that my approach was naive and unmarketable, he wanted to buy my success and claim credit for my vision. It was the most Robert Monroe move imaginable, If you can't beat them, acquire them and pretend it was your idea all along. Set up the meeting, I said. We met at his penthouse the following Tuesday. The same floor-to-ceiling windows, the same designer furniture, the same spectacular view of Lake Erie. But something was different now. Maybe it was the way he stood when I entered, slightly deferential instead of commanding. Maybe it was the fact that he'd asked me to come to him instead of summoning me. Or maybe it was the stack of newspapers on his coffee table, all featuring stories about EcoVest's success and Green Axis's collapse. You look well, he said, gesturing toward the leather couch where we'd had our disastrous conversation about sustainable investing 4 years earlier. I am well, I replied, remaining standing. Business is good. So I've heard? He poured himself a scotch from the same crystal decanter, but didn't offer me one. $2 billion valuation. Impressive for a company that prioritizes principles over profits. Turns out principles are profitable when you execute them correctly. He nodded slowly, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I underestimated you. I thought passion without pragmatism was a recipe for failure. I was wrong. About a lot of things. Yes. He took a sip of his drink. Monroe Capital Partners has had a difficult year. The Green Axis investment was poorly timed. We're facing significant losses, regulatory scrutiny, and reputational damage. I said nothing, letting him fill the silence. I'd like to propose a partnership, he continued. We have distribution networks, institutional relationships, and capital resources that could accelerate EcoVest's growth. You have a platform that actually works, and a team that understands sustainable investing better than anyone in the market. You want to buy me out? I want to work with you, as partners, as family. The word family hung in the air between us. This was the man who'd sent me that cruel graduation text, who'd funded my competitor, who'd spent years dismissing my dreams as naive idealism. Now he wanted to be partners. I appreciate the offer, I said finally, but I'm not interested. His composure slipped for just a moment. Rachel, this could be worth billions, for both of us. I'm already worth billions, or I will be when we go public next month. But think about what we could build together, my experience, your innovation. Your experience includes funding companies that lie to investors and destroy the credibility of sustainable investing. I interrupted. Your innovation includes trying to put me out of business because you couldn't accept that I might be right about something you were wrong about. I walked toward the door, then turned back to face him. You made your choice 4 years ago when you decided money was more important than family. Then you made it again when you funded Green Axis. I've made my choice too. Rachel. His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong. But we're still family. Family doesn't try to destroy each other's dreams for profit, I said. You chose money over me. Now I'm choosing integrity over you. The IPO launched 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning that felt like vindication incarnate. EcoVest went public at $42 a share and closed at $68, giving us a market capitalization of $2.8 billion. The trading floor at NYSE rang our opening bell while I stood with Aaron, Maria, James, and the rest of our team, watching years of 18-hour days and impossible challenges transform into financial reality. But the real satisfaction came from the impact report we published that same day. EcoVest had facilitated over $400 million in funding for verified sustainable companies. Our platform had helped create 12,000 green jobs, prevented 2.3 million tons of carbon emissions, and diverted 800,000 tons of waste from landfills. We hadn't just built a successful business. We'd built proof that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive after all. Standing on that trading floor, watching our stock price climb as investors recognized the value of authentic sustainable investing, I thought about that text message on graduation day. Don't expect help anymore. You're on your own now. He'd meant it as abandonment, but it had become liberation. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is proving that you don't need them after all. Thank you for listening to this story of determination, betrayal, and ultimate triumph. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story from? Please subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what other stories of resilience and revenge you'd like to hear. Your engagement means the world to us.